I will continue in the order that we have on the agenda. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Dean Jamieson. Dr. Jamieson is the health economist, the best known health economist, known for his work at the World Bank as well as the Disease Control Priorities Project. It's an honor for us to have you as Professor Emeritus at the University of California, San Francisco, Dean.
You have been working lately on pandemic preparedness, and you claim that the world is underprepared to deal with the next pandemic, and you quote a number of examples in recent history where we were totally caught by surprise. But you also make the point that this is not only a health problem, but potentially a huge economic problem as well. And you quote the cost of previous pandemics, and you anticipate that the next one will be even more costly. Can you comment on that?
Well, first, Jaime, and thanks very much for engaging me in this dialogue. I appreciate it. Is this on? Yes. I think there's a quite predictable three-phase cycle around pandemics. There's a period during the pandemic as it ramps up and starts to spread of fear, of panic, of substantial public health and much broader political investment in containing that pandemic. Then there's a second phase where there's a recognition in governments, a recognition in academia that typically we were not prepared, that this either could have been prevented or could have been cut off much earlier with the right medical responses or the right social responses. And that phase typically involves a series of studies and commissions and retrospectives. So if you take the Ebola epidemic in West Africa 2 years ago, the second phase generated 7 major substantive reports on how well prepared the world was, what went wrong, and what should be done next. So we had 7, really, and I've looked at these pretty carefully, quite thoughtful reports. I think Julio may have been involved in at least one of those. 3 of them. So you can endorse my comments there. Then the third phase is forgetfulness. The pandemic has receded into the past. The news cycle moves on to other things. There's the day-to-day demands on the medical system, on the public health system, that the medical system and the public health system return to. And that's where we are today. And that's why I think we remain unprepared. To comment briefly on the economic side, there are 2 big dimensions of economic consequence, and the one that, say, was most visibly illustrated by the Ebola epidemic, but was, say, earlier influenza epidemics in Asia, Mexico, North America, elsewhere in North America, Europe, was severe social and economic disruption. There's a fear of spread that closes down the many of the communication structures, schools sometimes. So there's a sharp response, and that's probably an important response. And there are quite a few studies now of the economic consequences of this this necessary social response to the sudden emergence of a new pathogen. But the dimension that is less well recognized is the potential, the value, the sheer value to human beings of avoiding risk of death and morbidity. And that's not captured in our standard economic analyses. And one of the things that I've been involved with in the last couple of years with Larry Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, is to try to get a handle on the magnitude of that economic cost using cost-benefit techniques that are standard in the OECD. And so that's where my own work has been going, Jaime.
You just mentioned Larry Summers. Larry Summers was here in Acapulco in the bank convention, and he has a statement, I think you shared the blog with me, that breaking NAFTA would be the major gift to China. Why is that?
Well, I think it's perhaps one of the potential major gifts to China that the current administration, it's not the only one, but the diversion of supply chains and production potentially to China, and the diversion of global economic leadership quite clearly now as the U.S. recedes from the probably useful, certainly central role it's played in the last 60 or 70 years. I think what Larry was referring to was that there's a gap of global leadership reflected in trade agreements like NAFTA, technical agreements like those on climate change, and the structuring of the global international system that leaves an opening to China. Now, maybe China will do a good job, so maybe that's not a bad thing, but it seems likely to happen, I think.
What do you envision as a potential collaboration between U.S. universities, particularly UC, and Mexican universities and Mexican authorities in pandemic preparedness? What would you like to see happening?
Well, I'll offer a few comments, but I think there are others in the room that might have thought about this longer than I have. I've newly gotten interested in it because of the economic dimensions and what I think of as really neglected economic dimensions. The three North American countries have in place a fairly well-structured set of pre-agreed responses on pandemics, legal and planning arrangements that I think represent a good, strong start for North American pandemic security. So we have a starting point. But in terms of specific investments and things that the state of California and Mexico have in common, obviously a long border, a lot of communication of people, goods, ideas, up and down that border. The kinds of steps that I think we might be able to take together that would allow these two political entities to go well beyond what global preparation or what U.S. preparation out of Washington is taking us would be on intensified surveillance, strengthening those capacities. I personally think, but this I think needs to be addressed more fully, that the vaccine production capacity for influenza vaccines in particular, and there's a debate on this, but my own reading of the literature is that the real big risks come from influenza rather than the Ebolas, the MERS, the SARS. Those are real enough. And those are important enough, but the influenza is the big thing that we're really not prepared for. And we can produce vaccines for influenza very quickly. The world knows how to do that. But it has modest manufacturing capacity. That manufacturing capacity in the case of a severe pandemic probably certainly needs to be much, much more substantial and can't be created at the time. And it needs to be highly dispersed. And this dispersal probably comes at some cost and efficiency, but the kinds of collaboration that I could imagine would be on the design and ultimately investment in a much improved vaccine response system. But I would stress there's certainly others here that might have fuller and better thoughts about preparation than I do.
We have here in the audience, I'm recognizing two ex-directors of the vaccine production, We have an expert in virus and infectology, and we have an expert in public health. I would like to ask first Pablo Curi for comments.
Que nos hiciera sus comentarios. Which is the capacity that we would have in Mexico for the production of vaccines in case of a new type of influenza? First, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of making a comment. First, I would say that let us not lose the vaccine of influenza in a pandemic will arrive late because of the times of production. Therefore, we would have to be prepared with other measures which are much more effective. And I fully coincide with you, Dr. Jameson. We are in phase number 3, and we are forgetting about that socially and generally speaking, even though we are not ready in preparedness terms. We have in North America the North American Preparedness ban. In the case of influenza, we still have to continue getting ready. They all have all the components of surveillance, preparedness, security, obviously vaccines. And people talk about having a reserve of pre-pandemic vaccines, but how are we going to know which will be the strain that will be generated in the next pandemic? It's impossible to know that. We may speculate H5N1, which was the one that we were ready for. H5N1 is still a risk, and be careful if it arrives, because lethality is 60%, 6 out of every 10 people who get this die. But there are things that have been done at the country level. When the secretary was Dr. Julio Frank and Dr. Roberto Tapia, they created the National Committee on Public Health in 2003, and the system has been strengthened with under the leadership of Dr. Pucci. They created the new INDRE, which it is recognized as a high-level laboratory that has to do with epidemic surveillance. I mean, many things are being done here in Mexico, but the discussion is not only that epidemic will come, because we know not when, but we are sure that we are going to have a pandemic of influenza. But now there is a second risk in the outlook, and that is to say that we can generate viruses of smallpox based on the genetic sequences that are generated. And this happened recently in the United States. And the question comes again, and should we have a smallpox vaccine stock, yes or no? Mexico purchased for the United States 230 million. The Secretary Thompson, 1 dose for each U.S. citizen. They applied 38,000 and the other expired. Mexico bought 1.6 million doses for the high vulnerable population, and they expired. So that's the dilemma in these forgetfulness phases. I mean, where are we going to invest? And now we know that there is a strengthening system, and when we face this crisis, I have to indicate it's not pandemics. Ebola was not. SARS was not pandemic. Chikungunya was not a pandemic. Zika has not been a pandemic, at least under the classical definitions of a pandemic. Nonetheless, they have generated a great concern, social concern. Sometimes, according to me, and I have said that we have exaggerated, as in the case of Zika. This is my personal view, because we are not seeing the thousands or millions of cases of macrocephalias. They have not existed as of today. And on the other hand, we also have a late reaction, like the case of Ebola. So we will never, ever have enough preparedness before these risks, because we never know when or how or where. So the way of approaching this is strengthening the surveillance system, training personnel, and having programs ready in order to have communication programs for the general public, because when you have this type of problems, what you have to do is, with the right information and with the evidence of what's happening, to report people without generating panic. And according to me, that's the challenge to prevent things from happening, like the case of Ebola or Zika, or which might happen with any other epidemic situation. Thank you very much, Pablo, for your comments.